The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above the ICU at Sacred Heart, the kind of sound that became white noise if you'd been listening long enough. Brooke Sullivan had been listening for 18 months. She moved through the ward with the economical precision of someone who'd learned efficiency in places where wasted motion meant wasted blood, her scrubs pristine despite the 3 arterial lines she'd managed that shift, her dark hair pulled back so tight it eliminated all possibility of distraction. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about hands that had once held a tourniquet against a femoral artery while mortars landed 50 yards out, they didn't develop the tremor most people called nerves. Room 347 needed vitals. She'd checked the assignment board 17 minutes ago, had already calculated medication schedules and fluid balances in the background of her mind while charting the previous patient's output. A Navy SEAL, post-training accident, still unconscious, still sedated. Blunt force trauma to the thoracic cavity. The attending notes were sparse, typical military stoicism, the kind of charts that mentioned injury without mentioning pain. She'd seen it before. Not in the hospital. In a different uniform. A different life that didn't exist anymore, officially, on any record that mattered. The door to 347 whispered open. She entered with her tablet, her pulse oximeter, her practice neutrality. The patient lay still under starched hospital linens, his breathing controlled by the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, a sound like a mechanical metronome keeping time with his chemical sleep. 2 full lines, 1 central line, cardiac monitoring, oxygen saturation holding at 94%. She moved through the ritual of assessment like a surgeon moving through muscle memory, each step a note in a song she'd played 10,000 times before. Temperature check. Blood pressure cuff sliding onto his left arm. The pneumatic hiss as it inflated, then the digital readout, 118/72. Good. Stable. She noted the numbers on her tablet and reached for the bandage on his right forearm, routine dressing check, nothing unusual about it. Then she saw it. Her name. Brooke Sullivan. Tattooed in bold capital letters, the ink jet black and fresh, running down his entire forearm in letters that must have taken hours to complete. The script was military precise, the kind of lettering that belonged on a memorial or a tombstone. She stared at the letters. Her hands didn't shake. That was training. That was years of learning to process shock in the time it took to breathe. She rewrapped the bandage with the same meticulous care she'd used when wrapping it yesterday, her fingers moving with deliberate slowness, buying time her brain didn't need. 7 seconds. 8. The tape sealed against his skin. She logged the vitals on her tablet and stepped back from the bed. The patient's breathing continued its mechanical rhythm. His eyes remained closed beneath sedation. There was no recognition possible, no moment of sudden consciousness where she could ask him why her name was burned into his skin, what mission had connected them before he became a body in room 347 at Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, before she became a woman in scrubs pretending not to know what 17 meant. She had no idea how long she stood there. The ventilator counted the seconds for her, 1 breath, 2, 3. Eventually, she moved. The nurse's station sat at the center of the ICU like a command post, all screens and monitors and the low hum of equipment that never stopped working. Jessica Chen was pulling labs. Marcus Hayes was charting in the corner, the overhead light catching the silver in his beard. Neither of them looked up as Brooke approached, and that was fine. She preferred the silence. She preferred the absence of casual conversation that might require her to be more present than she wanted to be. She entered her vitals into the system, room 347, all parameters normal, no changes from previous assessment, and had almost made it back to the medication cart when Dr. Sterling appeared. He didn't enter rooms the way normal doctors did, moving with purpose and efficiency. He glided. That was the only word for it. He moved like a man who'd never been told no, who'd never encountered resistance that mattered, who'd built his entire existence on the assumption that his presence was inherently valuable and that the world would arrange itself around his preferences. His white coat was pristine, crisp enough to cut on. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a talisman. He was 47 years old, on his second marriage, and controlled 40% of the hospital board's decisions through a combination of family connections and the kind of charm that worked on administrators but not, Brooke had noticed, on the nurses who actually knew how to save lives. He stopped at the nurses' station and his eyes tracked across the monitors until they found Brooke. She felt the moment his attention locked onto her the way you feel a shift in air pressure, not violent, but definite. A change. She continued her charting, kept her typing steady, didn't give him the satisfaction of looking up. Sullivan. His voice carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. My office. Tomorrow morning. 7 a.m. She turned to face him. Her jaw was neutral. Her eyes were flat, the kind of flat that came from having learned not to broadcast emotion, not in hostile territory, not when the cost of revealing what you were thinking might be paid in lives. She didn't stand up. That would have been too much, too confrontational. She simply met his gaze and nodded. Once. A single acknowledgement of words received, not necessarily accepted. I have the 6 a.m. admissions assessment, she said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. Her voice was the kind of steady that came from having given orders while helicopters landed and medics screamed for more units of O negative. I can reschedule. No. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. 7 is fine. You'll make it work. He turned and left before she could respond, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape. She watched him move toward the attending's office and then returned to her tablet. 7 a.m. A private office. Whatever this was about, it wasn't good. That much was clear from the tone, the timing, the way he'd phrased it as a command rather than a request. She should have been worried. Most people would have been worried. Worry would have been a reasonable response to a summons from the chief of medicine. Instead, she felt nothing but the professional necessity of cataloguing what might come next. She'd been in situations where the next moment determined whether she lived or died. She'd made decisions in 17 seconds that altered the course of lives she would never meet. A meeting with Dr. Sterling at 7 in the morning barely registered on that scale. She finished her charting and moved to the medication cart. The night shift settled into its rhythm. 12:15 a.m. The cardiac monitors beeped their ongoing surveillance. A patient in room 349 needed another dose of pain medication. She prepared the 4-push with the same precision she'd use for any drug that mattered, checking the dose twice, verifying the patient's armband, documenting everything in real time. This was where she was most visible. Not in meetings. Not in conversations. In the precise execution of tasks that could kill you if you were careless. She'd trained to be invisible in places where being seen meant you died. The hospital was simpler. She just had to be competent. And she was. Every single shift, she was competent. Marcus came by the cart around 1 a.m., grabbed some for supplies, and paused. Sterling's been weird today, he said. It wasn't a question directed at her. It was just observation. He chewed out Dr. Patel for a discharge summary that had a typo. A typo? I've never seen him like that. Stress, Brooke said. She didn't look up from the 4 tubing she was organizing. Perfectly coiled, perfectly precise, perfectly ready for the next emergency that might arrive at any moment. Budget meetings. Maybe. Marcus moved on, and she was grateful for that. Grateful he didn't press, didn't ask her what Sterling wanted, didn't recognize that she already knew what the next day would bring because she'd learned to read situations the way other people read books. The anger beneath his surface. The way his eyes had tracked her like prey. The tremor in his fingers that suggested he was barely contained. Something had happened. Something that made her a target. She didn't know what it was yet. But she would find out at 7 a.m. The rest of the night moved in the familiar pattern, assessments and medications, for adjustments, the constant vigilance that kept people breathing. She checked on the seal in room 347 one more time, around 4 a.m., when the rest of the unit was at its deepest quiet. His forearm was wrapped in fresh bandages. The letters underneath, her name, remained invisible but present, the way her entire past remained invisible but present. She noted his vitals. Breathing stable. O2 sat 95%. Heart rate steady. Recovery progressing normally. Everything in its place. She was wrapping the blood pressure cuff when something flickered across his face, not consciousness, but something beneath it. A muscle contraction. The unconscious brain responding to stimuli. She froze, her hand still on his arm, and waited. But the moment passed. His eyes remained closed. His breathing continued its chemical rhythm. Whatever had stirred in him faded back into the pharmaceutical darkness where they'd left him. She stepped back from the bed and checked the clock on the wall. 5:17 a.m. Less than 2 hours until her meeting with Sterling. She finished her shift notes at 6:45, changed into the fresh scrubs she kept in her locker, the one she wore for meetings, pressed and perfect, and made her way to the administrative wing. The halls were emptier here, carpeted instead of tiled, smelling of leather furniture and the particular staleness that came from sealed office buildings designed before anyone understood air circulation. She'd walked into worse spaces. She'd cleared rooms where the only light came from the muzzle flashes of the people shooting at her. This hallway felt smaller somehow. Dr. Sterling's office door was closed. She knocked once, precisely, and waited for his voice before entering. He was already behind his desk, his coffee steaming in front of him, his expression arranged into something that resembled professional concern but wasn't. Sullivan. Good. Sit. She sat a day. Her hands remained on her lap. Her posture was perfect, not military perfect, just professional perfect, the kind of posture that belonged in a hospital office and not in a briefing room 7,000 miles away. She said nothing, waiting for him to speak. Waiting was something she'd learned to do. Waiting meant you gathered information instead of volunteering it. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. Dr. Sterling's office door opened at 7:15 a.m., before the morning shift briefing, before the surgical cases rolled in, when the hallway still smelled like floor wax and the previous night's exhaustion. Brooke knew the summons had nothing to do with commendation. She'd corrected his dosage calculation in front of a resident 3 weeks ago, not loudly, not publicly, just a quiet observation. That's 2.4 milligrams per kilogram, doctor. Patient weight is 78 kilos. The resident had frozen. Sterling's jaw had tightened. He'd recalculated and changed the order without acknowledgement, which meant he'd known it was wrong and she'd made him know it was witnessed. He didn't offer her a seat. His office held a leather chair, a mahogany desk, and a photograph of Sterling shaking hands with the hospital board chairman at some charity gala, both of them holding champagne glasses and smiling like men who'd never been told no. The air conditioning hummed cold as a vault. Your charting from Tuesday needs clarification, he said, not looking up from his computer screen. Room 312. The medication administration time. Brooke kept her hand still. I can pull the chart. What's the concern? He finally looked at her, and his eyes held the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. The concern is that you documented administering 0.5 milligrams of lorazepam at 08 for 7 hours, but the order wasn't written until 0850. That's a 3-minute discrepancy that suggests either falsification or reckless disregard for chain of command. She'd checked that chart 3 times since Tuesday. The order was verbal at 08 for 2, Dr. Sterling. The resident confirmed it. I documented the verbal authorization, waited for the written order, and then administered when the chart was complete per protocol. The timing is accurate. You're contradicting me. His voice didn't rise. That was worse than shouting. Low voices meant certainty. And you're doing it with that same tone you've been using since the incident with the dosage calculation. As if you're the authority in this room. Before she could respond, he stood. Come with me. Room 312 held Mrs. Chen, 83 years old, recovering from a hip replacement, and her daughter sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her son standing near the window. They both looked up when Sterling entered, Brooke following a step behind like a subordinate who'd been summoned for discipline. Which was the point? Sterling gestured to Brooke's chart documentation displayed on the bedside computer. Nurse Sullivan made an error with medication timing yesterday. We need to review it. His voice carried across the room with the precision of a man performing for an audience. Can either of you confirm what time the medication was given? The daughter leaned forward. I think it was mid-morning. Maybe around 9. Sterling's lips tightened. He turned to Brooke. Nurse Sullivan documented 08 for 7. Your family says 0900. That's a significant discrepancy. Brooke pulled the chart up on the portable workstation. Her documentation was exact. Verbal order 08 for 2, from Drive Patel, written confirmation 0850, administration 08 for 7 with 2 nurse verification noted in the electronic record. It was all there. It was all correct. And Sterling knew it was correct because he'd written similar documentation 100 times, the verbal authorization window, the written confirmation lag, the standard protocol that every nurse and resident in the hospital followed. The documentation is complete per ICU protocol, Brooke said. Her voice remained level. Professional. Verbal order was taken at 08 for 2, confirmed by Dr. Patel and the charge nurse, medication administered at 08 for 7, written order received at 0850. Sterling's face reddened like someone had turned up the temperature in the room. Are you contradicting me in front of a patient's family? The daughter shifted uncomfortably. Should we step out? I don't want to be in the middle of. Not necessary, Sterling interrupted. This is exactly the kind of insubordination I've been documenting, Sullivan. You think your little clinical heroics make you special. That you can operate outside the normal chain of command because you believe you know better than your attending physician. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that sounded reasonable but felt like a threat. That attitude ends now. I'm initiating a formal performance review, and I'm recommending to HR that your references be verified independently. Brooke took one measured breath. Her hands remained steady, palms open, the gesture of someone with nothing to hide. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, not from emotion, but from the physical weight of holding everything together under pressure, the same pressure that had taught her to compartmentalize in Baghdad when mortars landed 100 yards away and you still had to run the 4 line. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, without changing her posture, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. I've followed every protocol to the letter, Dr. Sterling, and we both know it, she said quietly. He dismissed her with a wave, already turning back to Mrs. Chen and her family. I apologize for the disruption. Nurse Sullivan will be reassigned to day shift pending the review. The words were reasonable. The tone was demolition. She left the room with her spine straight, her scrubs unwrinkled, her hands not shaking. The hallway stretched in front of her, fluorescent and endless, and she walked it the way she'd walked through dust storms in Fallujah, forward, without hesitation, without looking back. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room on the 2nd floor had a refrigerator that wheezed like a dying patient, a microwave that hummed at a frequency that made your teeth ache, and a table where the ICU day shift gathered for lunch. Brooke had eaten in this room for 3 years. She knew every scratch on the vinyl chairs, every coffee stain on the laminate table, every rotation of staff who cycled through with their Tupperware and their gossip and their human normalcy. Thursday afternoon, she sat down with her leftover pasta, something she'd made Sunday night, still sealed in a cracked Tupperware container, and opened it carefully. The smell of marinara and basil rose from the container, familiar and small. 3 veteran nurses, Carol, who'd been in the ICU for 18 years, Marcus, who'd trained half the current staff, and Diana, who'd helped Brooke study for her recertification, glanced at each other. They were holding sandwiches, a yogurt, some fruit. They saw her sit. And in the space of maybe 5 seconds, they all gathered their food, scraped their chairs back, and left. No words. No acknowledgement. Just the sound of shoes on tile and the door closing and the hum of the refrigerator, which suddenly seemed very loud. Brooke ate alone. The pasta was cold but fine. The clock on the wall ticked from 12:47 to 12:48 to 12:49. She was the only person in the room. The emptiness had a weight to it, the specific gravity of professional isolation, the kind that spreads like sepsis if you're not careful. One person leaves the room. Then two. Then the message gets delivered through the ecosystem, do not associate with her. Sterling's name wasn't attached to the exodus, but it was written in their absence. By Friday morning, a document appeared on the unit board near the nursing station. Hospital letterhead. Times New Roman, 12-point font. Printed and official and impossible to ignore. Formal performance review, confidential notation. Employee name, Brooke Sullivan, RN. Date of incident, multiple dates listed. Category, failure to follow chain of command. Notes, repeated instances of contradicting attending physicians. Insubordination during patient care. Questionable judgment regarding protocol interpretation. Recommendation, probationary status pending further investigation. Signed, Dr. Marcus Sterling, MD, Chief of Medicine. Her name was highlighted in yellow. The language was calculated, not quite accusatory enough to be prosecuted, but explicit enough to signal that association with her carried professional risk. Two newer nurses, both still in their first year, read it as they passed. She watched their eyes scan the document, then slide toward her without actual contact. The kind of look you give someone you're not supposed to talk to. Sterling watched from his office window on the other side of the unit. His arms were crossed. He wasn't quite smiling, but his face held the satisfaction of someone who'd moved a chess piece exactly where he needed it. That's when the real nightmare began, though she wouldn't know it for another 18 hours. The email from Human Resources arrived at 18:43 hours, forwarded to her personal account. Ms. Sullivan, we are conducting a routine verification of your employment history. Please report to HR Conference Room B on Thursday, January 16 at 0800 hours for a formal interview regarding discrepancies in your application materials. This is standard procedure. Bring any documentation you have available. Regards, Sarah Chen, Director of Human Resources. Discrepancies. That single word contained everything Sterling needed. He'd begun his calls. She didn't know about the private investigator yet, the man who'd been hired to dig into her 4-year employment gap, the years she couldn't claim, couldn't explain, couldn't put on any resume because the CIA had buried them under non-disclosure agreements and classification stamps. She didn't know Sterling had contacted the state nursing board with allegations of scope violations, or that he'd already called the references she'd listed and introduced doubt with careful questions. Have you known her for the full period listed? Are you aware of any gaps in her employment history? What she knew was that the careful architecture of her civilian life was being examined by someone who'd learned how to weaponize institutional process against people he wanted gone. In room 347, the Navy SEAL remained unconscious through the evening, his chest tube draining clear fluid, his vitals stable at 98 degrees, heart rate 62 and steady. Brooke checked on him during her rounds at 19:30 hours. His left forearm lay across the blanket, and in the soft glow of the cardiac monitor she could see the tattoo in bold letters, Brooke Sullivan. Not her full name. Just those two words, rendered in black ink by someone who'd wanted her name permanently etched into his skin. He'd been unconscious when she'd carried him from the rubble of a collapsed building in Baghdad's Jolan district. He'd never known her face. When his eyes opened at 2100 hours, he blinked at the ceiling, then at her, without recognition. There was no moment of remembrance, no flash of gratitude to someone he'd never consciously met. Do we know each other? He asked, his voice rough from the endotracheal tube they'd removed that morning. Brooke finished adjusting his full line. No. Rest now. She didn't tell him she'd learned 3 languages to communicate with his team. She didn't tell him she'd stayed awake for 47 hours straight so someone else could sleep. She didn't tell him that his name was in her deposition, redacted from every official record, classified so deep that the government had decided it was safer for everyone if she forgot it too. She just checked his oxygen saturation, 98%, good, and dimmed the lights. The night shift continued. Vital signs stable. Falls running. Medications given on schedule. Everything correct. Everything documented. Everything by the book. And somewhere in an office that she couldn't see, Sterling was making phone calls. Thursday morning, the sky over Raleigh hung the color of wet concrete, rain threatening but not yet falling, and Brooke Sullivan arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her scheduled HR interview. She'd worn a blouse instead of scrubs, the fabric stiff from the dry cleaner, a small armor against what was coming. The hallway to the administrative wing felt longer than it should, fluorescent panels casting everything in that institutional yellow that made skin look diseased. She passed the break room where yesterday someone had left a sticky note on her lunch container that said "use your own shelf" for words that had become a thesis on how completely she'd been erased from the social contract of the unit. The HR director's office was on the 3rd floor, past the chapel and the gift shop, a corridor where she rarely walked. Brooke took the stairs instead of the elevator, her left leg tight from the night shift, each step a small negotiation with her own body. Muscle memory from Baghdad was useful in crisis. It was useless in bureaucratic hallways, and she felt the weight of her contained power like something trying to claw its way out through her ribs. She'd learned in her previous life how to make herself smaller, how to take up less space, how to absorb the kind of small humiliations that would break ordinary people. She'd learned it in a sandstorm near Fallujah when she was 24 years old and not supposed to exist. The 3rd floor landing smelled like the chemical ghost of cleaning solution mixed with old coffee. She could hear typing from somewhere, the soft rattle of keyboards, the sounds of people building their days in ordinary ways. The HR office door was glass with frosted lettering that said Human Resources, Margaret Chen, Director. Brooke knocked at 6:52, 8 minutes early, and a voice called, "Come in." She opened the door and Margaret Chen looked up from her desk with an expression that had already calcified into something professional and distant. Behind her, on the wall, hung a diploma from Duke and a family photo where everyone was smiling in that posed way that meant they'd been told to hold it for 5 seconds. Margaret's nails were painted a shade of pink that probably had a name like Barely There. "Brooke, thank you for coming in." Margaret gestured to a chair across the desk, the kind of chair that sits lower than the desk chair, a physics of power played out in furniture. "I know this is unusual on short notice." "Of course." Brooke sat, her hands loose in her lap, her jaw held at the angle that meant she was ready for impact. She'd learned that composure was a weapon people never saw coming. Anger they could understand. Panic they could exploit. But stillness made them uneasy. It made them talk. "I've been reviewing some concerns that have been raised regarding your employment here at Sacred Heart." Margaret opened a folder with Brooke's name typed on the tab. Specifically regarding protocol adherence and professional interactions with attending physicians. The folder was thin, which meant the contents were fabricated, which meant Dr. Sterling had called before 6 a.m. and the machinery of bureaucracy had already begun to turn. There have been reports of insubordination. Of undermining chain of command. Brooke didn't blink. She let the silence sit for 3 seconds, which felt like 30. Margaret fidgeted with a pen, a small tell that meant she was uncomfortable delivering words that weren't hers. "What I'm looking at here doesn't align with your previous employment records," Margaret continued, trying to fill the quiet. "There's nothing in your background check that mentions any kind of formal discipline." "That's because there hasn't been any," Brooke said. 9 words. Short and clean. She could see Margaret's fingers tighten on the pen. The director wanted Brooke to defend herself, to scramble, to provide an opening that could be weaponized into proof of instability. Instead, Brooke waited. "Well, we're going to need to conduct a more thorough investigation. In the meantime, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a review of." Margaret's phone lit up. The screen flashed red. Code blue. The alarms were old enough that they still made a sound like a fire truck, a piercing wail that had no indoor voice. Margaret's head tilted toward the intercom speaker mounted in the corner. "Code blue, ICU, room 347. Code blue, ICU, room 347. Brooke was already standing. Room 347 was the SEAL's room, the man whose name was tattooed on his forearm in letters he'd earned in a desert she wasn't supposed to remember. 3 flights up. Her left leg screamed on the stairs, overuse from night shift, the kind of pain that was information but not instruction, and she ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore a lot of things. The ICU doors burst open under her hands and she was moving through a landscape she knew better than sleep. The monitor alarms were a symphony of panic. The SEAL's room was 3 doors down, and she could see Sterling already there, his back to her, his voice high and fractured in a way that meant he was losing control of something. Increase oxygen to 100%, push 0.5 milligrams epi, get a chest X-ray stat. Sterling barked at a resident who moved like he was underwater, slow and confused. The SEAL's chest was caving inward on the right side, his ribs pulling in like something was trying to suck him into himself. His lips were the color of a bruise, and his jugular veins were distended, bulging outward like they were going to explode from the pressure beneath them. Brooke's eyes found his trachea. Deviated left. All the air that should have been in his lungs was in the space between his lung and his chest wall, collapsing everything, and Sterling was wasting time ordering imaging that wouldn't help and drugs that wouldn't matter if the patient died in the next 2 minutes from what Brooke could see happening right there in front of them. She stepped forward. "Dr. Sterling, he needs immediate needle decompression." Sterling spun around. His face was the color of old plaster, and his eyes went to her with the weight of pure focused hatred. "I didn't ask for your input, Sullivan. Follow my orders." The monitor alarm screamed its digital panic. The SEAL's oxygen saturation was dropping, 92, 88, 84, with the numbers falling like stones. His lips were turning from purple to blue, cyanotic blue, the blue of someone drowning on dry land. The right side of his chest barely rose with each breath. The left side was compensating, working alone, burning out. He had maybe 2 minutes. 3 if they were lucky. "You are on probation," Sterling said, and he moved toward the crash cart like he owned the room, like he owned the physics of bodies and the mathematics of blood flow and the absolute certainty of dying. "If you touch that patient without my direct order, you're finished. Completely finished." The resident stood frozen, a syringe in one hand, a vial of epinephrine in the other, waiting for clarity that wasn't coming. The monitor went from screaming to something worse, a slower alarm that meant the oxygen was dropping past any acceptable threshold, past the point where human brains could tolerate. 78. 73. 68. Brooke took one measured breath. She met Sterling's eyes, and something in her shifted, not visibly, not in any way he could see, but internally, a door opening to rooms she hadn't been allowed to access for 6 years. "Then I'm finished," she said. She moved past the residents like they were furniture. The crash cart was metal and sterile and within reach. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle, her hand steady, her movements precise, the kind of precision that comes from having done this before in darkness with mortars landing 50 yards out and people screaming in languages she understood. She tore open the SEAL's gown. She felt for the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, and her body found them without her mind needing to instruct it. Muscle memory took over. The needle went in. The hiss of released pressure filled the room like a punctured tire, like air being freed from a space it shouldn't occupy, and in that 1 second the universe corrected itself. The SEAL's lips went from blue to pink. His chest rose symmetrically, both sides moving together like wings. His oxygen saturation climbed, 68, 72, 79, 84, 88, the numbers rising like salvation written in numbers. The monitor stopped screaming. It returned to its normal rhythm, beeping its steady mechanical song, and Brooke stepped back from the bed with her hands still steady, her breathing still level, her entire being contained in that perfect military stillness that didn't leave room for anything like fear or doubt. The room went dead silent. Dr. Sterling's face drained white, then filled with red like someone was inflating him with rage. His jaw opened and closed. His hands clenched. For 3 full seconds, he couldn't seem to assemble language, and when he finally did, his voice came out like something broken. "Security! Now! Get her out of my hospital!" But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. The worst part was what happened next, what was already happening in the hallway, what nobody had told him about yet. 2 Marines in dress blues had just walked past the ICU nursing station, and they weren't asking for permission. The needle was in her hand before her conscious mind finished the decision. 14-gauge angiocath, the kind that punches through ribs and sternum like it's tissue paper, like she'd done it in the dust storms outside Fallujah when the mortars were landing 50 yards out and her hands moved on instinct alone. The residents froze. Dr. Sterling's voice cracked an order, wrong, medically wrong, a death sentence in 3 minutes, and Brooke didn't hear it. She heard only the SEAL's oxygen saturation dropping like a stone, heard the wet rattle in his chest, heard the pressure building inside his lungs like a bomb nobody was defusing. She moved through the cluster of white coats like water finding a current. No excuses. No asking permission. Her shoulder bumped a resident aside, light, efficient, not aggressive, and her left hand found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from 18 years of muscle memory that most nurses never acquired because most nurses had never been field medics in a combat zone. The SEAL's lips were blue. Cyanotic. Dying. The skin over his ribs felt like leather, cold and waxy, and her fingers found the space between two bones the way a locksmith reads a lock. 15 seconds. She swabbed with one hand, positioned with the other. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through pleural membrane. The hiss came like a held breath finally released, like pressure bleeding from a punctured tire, like a man's life valve opening at the exact moment it needed to open. The sound filled the room. Her jaw stayed locked. Her breathing stayed steady. The SEAL's oxygen saturation climbed, 75. 82. 90. His lips shifted from blue to pink like someone was adjusting a color filter. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. Strong. Regular. Alive. Dr. Sterling's face had been white. Now it was red. Not the red of embarrassment, the red of a man watching his authority dissolve in front of residents, in front of attending physicians, in front of a patient's family who'd been watching from the hallway. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The words came out as a whisper, then louder, security. Now. Nurse Sullivan is to be escorted from the premises immediately. His voice had the texture of grinding glass. She performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. I don't care what the outcome is. Protocol exists for a reason. The resident who'd watched the entire thing, the kid named Patterson, 3 months from finishing his residency, his entire future dependent on Sterling's evaluation, opened his mouth. The words were forming. Brooke could see them behind his teeth. Then he saw Sterling's eyes. The kid's mouth closed. His face went blank. He looked away. 2 security guards arrived within 90 seconds. They knew the drill. They moved with the apologetic patience of men who'd done this 100 times, who understood this wasn't personal, who'd learned not to read the situations too carefully. The older one, Martinez, had worked Sacred Heart for 16 years. He'd brought her coffee twice. He didn't meet her eyes now. Badge and access revocation, the younger guard asked Sterling. Effective immediately. Escort her to her locker. She has 10 minutes to collect her personal items. Nothing hospital property leaves with her. Brooke didn't resist. Resistance would have meant drama, meant giving him the satisfaction of a struggle, meant making his case stronger. Instead, she moved like her body was separate from her mind, like she was watching herself walk toward the elevator from somewhere above, somewhere safer, somewhere that had learned a long time ago how to separate the self from the moment. The locker room was empty. The evening shift was already on the floors, and the day shift had cleared out an hour ago. She could hear the ventilators humming in the distance, the monitors beeping their steady rhythms, the intercom crackling codes and announcements. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like insects trapped in plastic. Her locker was unremarkable, magnetic mirror, 2 hooks, a shelf. The cardboard box from the supply closet was the kind used for paper and printer cartridges. It barely took 3 minutes. The cracked mug came first. It said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded blue letters, a gift from the residents 2 years ago, ceramic chipped along the rim from 1,000 dishwasher cycles. She wrapped it in paper towels and set it gently in the box. The dying succulent followed, a small jade plant with brown-tipped leaves, a gift from someone whose name she couldn't quite place anymore, someone who'd stopped talking to her around day 12 of Sterling's campaign. It weighed almost nothing. The soil in its pot had gone hard and compacted, evidence of neglect, of Brooke working doubles and triples and not having energy to water growing things. The photo came last. Glossy 8x10, taken in Baghdad in 2017, in front of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers compound near Mosul. 8 faces. Brooke stood in the center back row, her hair covered by a tan headscarf, her uniform the color of dust, her eyes the kind of steady that doesn't come from living a normal life. To her left, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen, smile like a wolf showing its teeth, already gone, IED, Anbar Province, August 2019. To her right, Chief Hospital Corpsman David Doc Reeves, tattoo of a cross visible on his forearm, still here, somewhere in Virginia teaching SEAL Team 8. In front, Petty Officer Third Class Rivera, young, scared, trying not to look it. Gone. Petty Officer Second Class James Holloway, call sign a breaker, the man who'd carried her 6 kilometers when her legs had stopped working after the checkpoint firefight. Gone. Missing. Classified. The file would say he'd drowned in training. The file was a lie. She looked at the photo for 8 seconds. Then she placed it face down in the box. The combat boots stayed wrapped in plastic at the bottom of the locker, sealed in their original packaging, the laces never tied, the leather never scuffed. They were replica pairs, close but not exact, made after the originals had been taken as evidence. Those originals were in a federal facility somewhere, probably in a climate-controlled storage room in Virginia, probably never to be seen again. These were the ones she'd bought online, the ones that didn't matter, the ones that were only boots. She didn't pack them. Martinez carried the box to the ER exit. The main corridor was busy, evening shift in motion, code team gathered near Trauma Bay 2, families in the waiting room, the organized chaos of a hospital that never stopped running. Brooke walked beside him and the other guard, her ID badge already gone from her scrubs, and she watched as people clocked her exit and then deliberately looked away. The nurse she'd mentored on needle thoracostomy, who'd worked beside her for 18 months, suddenly found her shoes fascinating. A resident she'd corrected on proper chest compression depth turned toward a wall. The trauma surgeon who'd pulled her aside last month and whispered, "Just ride it out, this will blow over," was nowhere in sight. The automatic doors opened. The parking lot exhaled wet air. Rain had started while she was inside, the kind of November rain that felt like it had weight, like it was accumulating even as it fell. The cardboard began to absorb moisture immediately, the bottom corners softening, the mug shifting inside its paper towel wrapping. She carried the box at waist level, like it was unstable, like it might fall apart if she shifted her grip wrong. The bus stop on Western Boulevard was 3 blocks away. She walked it in silence, the rain hammering down now, cold and steady, the kind of rain that made the city sound like it was underwater. A car passed with its windows up, music bleeding out around the seals. Someone shouted something from the sidewalk. She didn't look back. The cardboard box grew heavier with each block, absorbing water, its structural integrity degrading. By the time she reached the bus stop, it was starting to collapse. The mug shifted again. Another small crack split the ceramic. Inside room 347, the Navy SEAL woke fully for the first time since the crash, lucid and solid, his oxygen saturation holding at 94%, the crisis metabolizing into recovery. His eyes moved around the room, registering the EKG monitor, the 4 line in his hand, the drain tube protruding from his chest. Confusion first. Then clarity. He turned his head toward the resident who'd been checking his vitals, Patterson, the one with the scared eyes. "Who did the needle decompression?" The SEAL's voice was hoarse, raw from the intubation tube. "When I went down, who made the first move?" Patterson hesitated. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. He could feel Sterling's presence still in the room, could feel his career hanging in a waiting area somewhere, could feel the weight of finishing his residency in 6 weeks without this man's approval. Then he thought about what he'd watched. He thought about protocol, about outcomes, about the fact that human beings don't perform procedures like that without training. Human beings don't move with that kind of precision. Human beings don't create life under pressure without something else running underneath, something deeper than the 3 years of medical school taught. A nurse, Patterson said. Brooke Sullivan. She was on probation. She's no longer employed here. They just terminated her. The SEAL's hand moved to his right forearm, the one with the bandage across the bicep, the one with the tattoo underneath. His fingers traced the shape through the gauze. Sullivan. Brooke Sullivan. Baghdad, 2017. A face in dust and chaos. A voice speaking colloquial Arabic at a checkpoint. A hand reaching out when it would have been safer to look away. A woman who'd been erased from her own service record, whose medals had been locked in a vault, whose name had been classified so completely that even the Pentagon had to redact it in official documents. The SEAL reached for his phone with shaking hands. He knew a number that only a handful of people on Earth possessed. He'd memorized it in Mosul. He'd carried it for 6 years without telling a single soul he was carrying it. The call went through on the second ring. Naval Special Warfare Command, this is the duty officer speaking. This is Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, Operation Sandborn, 2017. His voice cracked like he was breaking into something locked. I need to report that a classified asset has been terminated from Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, approximately 2 hours ago. Her name is Brooke Sullivan. Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. And I need that reported to the Admiral immediately. The duty officer went very quiet. Then, say that name again, Petty Officer. Spell the last name. Sullivan. Sullivan Brooke. Brooke. She saved my life today using classified field medicine. And they fired her for it. 24 hours after she saved his life, 2 Marines in dress blues appeared at Brooke's apartment at 6 in the morning. No warning. No phone call. They stood in her doorway with the kind of silence that meant classified orders, and one of them said simply, "Come with us." She didn't ask questions. People who asked questions got people killed. She changed into civilian clothes, grabbed her wallet, and followed them down 4 flights of stairs to a waiting sedan with government plates. The rain from the night before had turned the parking lot into a mirror, reflecting the grey sky back at itself like a prophecy. The drive to Sacred Heart took 12 minutes. Neither Marine spoke. The radio crackled occasionally with static that meant encrypted channels, and Brooke watched the city scroll past, the same city where she'd been escorted out in disgrace, where her name was still attached to a firing that would look like negligence on every future application, where Dr. Sterling had won. Or so he thought. The atrium of Sacred Heart was alive with activity when they arrived. Network camera crews were setting up near the main entrance. Producers barked orders. An NBC van idled near the ambulance bay, and Brooke's stomach tightened. One of the Marines placed a steady hand on her back. "Stay with us," he said. The door slid open. The atrium froze when she entered. Staff members stopped mid-conversation. The camera swiveled. And then a stretcher wheeled through from the cardiac unit, an older man in hospital attire, flanked by a translator and 2 security guards. The man's eyes found Brooke across the expanse of tile and polished steel, and his face went the color of old paper. He began to shake. The translator, a woman in her early 30s with a surgical mask hanging around her neck, moved close to him, speaking in rapid Arabic, and his hand gripped her wrist hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Then he looked at Brooke again, and he spoke in English fractured by decades of distance. "You are the one from the Mosul checkpoint. The woman who spared me." The cameras caught everything. The room held its breath. Brooke's composure didn't crack, but her hands, those steady hands that had carried 17 bodies through fire in Baghdad, felt suddenly heavy at her sides. The translator stepped forward, her voice shaking. "He says you held the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer. He says you saved his life at a checkpoint in 2018, when your unit could have killed him. He says you chose mercy instead. The translator's eyes filled with tears. I'm his daughter. I've been looking for you for 6 years. My father's been looking for you for 6 years. A Navy commander in dress white stepped forward from the wings of the atrium. Brooke hadn't seen him arrive, which meant he'd been waiting, watching. He handed her a manila folder, declassified papers that felt weightless and impossible in her hands. Her eye scanned the first page, and the words blurred, Operation Sanborn. Redacted. Redacted. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy Cross. Citation she was never allowed to claim. A career the CIA had erased. A woman she wasn't supposed to be. Senior Chief Sullivan, the commander said, his voice carrying across the atrium with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard in chaos. The cameras pivoted toward him. Your service record has been declassified effective immediately. The President of the United States requests your presence tomorrow to receive the recognition we should have given you 6 years ago. He turned. His eyes found Dr. Sterling, who stood near the administrator's office, his face a careful blank that had already begun to fracture. The commander's voice dropped into the cold register of someone delivering a sentence. Dr. Sterling, you are terminated effective immediately for attempting to destroy a decorated war hero. For fabricating charges against a service member. For contacting her references to sabotage her employment. And for interfering with patient care to cover your own medical error. Naval Criminal Investigative Service will be reviewing your actions for potential federal charges. Sterling's mouth opened. He looked around the atrium as if expecting someone to contradict this, to restore the world to the order he'd constructed. The administrator stepped away from him physically, creating distance like an infection control protocol. 2 security guards, the same ones who'd escorted Brooke out days before, approached Sterling with the same detached professionalism they'd used with her. One reached for his badge. Do you understand what you're doing? Sterling's voice cracked. I've been chief of medicine for 12 years. I've brought millions in funding to this institution. This is slander. This is justice, the commander said flatly. Security, please escort Dr. Sterling from the building. His access is revoked effective immediately. The cameras captured it all. Sterling was walked through the same corridor where Brooke had carried her cardboard box, his face the color of a patient coding, his mouth moving but producing no sound that mattered anymore. Past the nurses' station where staff stared openly. Past the residents who filmed on their phones. The automatic doors closed behind him like a verdict. The Iraqi man wept openly. His daughter embraced Brooke, and Brooke allowed herself to be held by someone whose father she'd spared at a checkpoint in a sandstorm 6 years ago, when mercy had felt like treason and she'd done it anyway. The SEAL from room 347 appeared from the cardiac unit, his chest tube still visible beneath his hospital gown, and he came to attention despite the pain it cost him. Senior Chief, he said, and that one phrase, her rank spoken aloud by someone who knew exactly what it meant, cracked something open in her chest. Within a week, the State Medical Board opened an investigation into 3 malpractice complaints that board members had helped Sterling bury. Within 2 weeks, Sacred Heart severed all ties to him and revoked his privileges. Within a month, his attorney negotiated a surrender of his medical license pending formal review to avoid federal charges. Within 3 months, a volunteer arriving for her shift at Sacred Heart stopped at the grocery store on Western Boulevard. She saw Dr. Sterling at a folding table outside the entrance, wearing a cheap polo shirt, a banner behind him reading supplemental insurance, affordable rates. He was handing flyers to people who mostly ignored him, his hands trembling in a way Brooks never would, the rain beginning again, water pooling around the legs of his table. She took a photograph and posted it to the hospital staff Facebook group. It received 347 reactions in 2 hours. The next morning, Brooke stood in the Oval Office wearing her dress blues, the uniform she hadn't worn since Operation Sanborn was buried and her name was classified into non-existence. The president pinned the Navy Cross to her chest, the highest medal for valor, positioned 3rd on her uniform rack, below the Silver Star and the Purple Hearts. Cameras flashed. Behind the president's desk, in a glass display case lined with navy blue velvet, sat her combat boots from Baghdad. Worn leather. Salt stains from sweat. Sand still visible in the seams, ground into the treads from 17 extractions under fire. No one had polished them clean. No one had replaced the soles. They'd preserved them exactly as they'd been abandoned on a tarmac in 2018, waiting for an owner who could finally claim them. The Iraqi translator's father sat in the front row beside the SEAL from room 347, who stood at attention despite his healing chest. After the ceremony, the SEAL approached Brooke alone. He rolled up his sleeve, showing her the tattoo of her name done in heavy black ink across his forearm. "I got this a month after Baghdad," he said, his voice carrying the steadiness of someone trained to communicate across impossible distances. "They told me a medic named Sullivan carried me out under fire, but the records were classified. I never knew your first name. I never knew your face. But I knew I owed you my life." Brooke's composure, which had held through Baghdad and humiliation and firing and erasure, finally fractured. Tears streamed freely, without restraint, without the discipline that had kept her standing through everything else. "You were number 14, she said. "I carried 17 that day. I remember every one." The president's chief of staff approached with an envelope. "Senior Chief Sullivan, Walter Reed Medical Center has extended an offer for you to lead their combat trauma training program, if you're interested. They want to train the next generation in the techniques that kept your team alive." Brooke looked at the boots in their case, at the faces gathered before her, fellow SEALs, former patients, a translator whose father she'd spared, nurses from Sacred Heart who'd finally been allowed to see who they worked beside. She took one measured breath, but this time she wasn't holding anything back. "I'm interested," she said. The footage cuts to Brooke walking through Walter Reed in her Navy uniform, instructing a room full of combat medics in needle decompression, in triage under fire, in the mathematics of mercy. News coverage plays over her training sequences, the ceremony, the Admiral's words, Sterling's fall captured and replayed. And then the image returns to those worn combat boots in their glass case at the White House, a brass plaque beneath them reading, SCPO Brooke Sullivan, Operation Sanborn, not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Let's discuss in the comments. Thank you for watching.